repairing relationships, reconnecting. Reconciliation was at the heart of Francis's life and ministry. And so there was a sense in which he was, I think he did see himself as repairing the relationship between us humans and the world around us and the creatures around us. A more peaceful, a more just, a more at home kind of relationship. So I think, although he probably if you'd interviewed him at the end of his life, he wouldn't have put it in the same terms. But nevertheless, I think there's this, as Simon says, the seeds of that are there. That broader vision.
Thank you. There's another question. What was the medieval view out of which Francis's view developed? And that's a really interesting question. And if you get a Francis nerd like me off talking about it, we could be here all night. But I think that it's fair to say, and this is when Nicholas Allen might have a comment in a sec, I think it's fair to say that the medieval view in Francis's time was quite creation unaffirming. It was very an example of that would be the Cathars, which I think I mentioned somewhere in my section. So that at the time that Francis was living, there was this group of people who basically said that everything spiritual is good and everything non-spiritual, in other words, everything created, is not good. And they were very black and white about it. I mean, I'm not an expert on it at all, but it gives you a sense of some of those views that were around, that actually creation was just, you know, something that you muddle through to make a living from in order to develop the spiritual part of you, which is the bit that went to heaven. Nick, do you want to say something about that? Because I think you're probably...
Yeah, I suppose one way it comes out in Francis is that what he talks about in his writings and his letters to everyone is things like the Eucharist. So it's all about, you know, the coming of God in a physical way and receiving him like that, rather than in a sort of abstract sense of God, the source of all being, whatever, which Bonaventure might go for a bit more. But for Francis, it was the actual the reality of this little bit of wafer, and he was just amazed that God was with us in that way. And that was something that the Cathars didn't really go for.
And it's quite a contemporary heresy, contemporary to us as well, because actually there's within our contemporary culture, there's the idea that actually it's the spiritual that counts, or it's the ideas that count. It's rather than actually the mucky stuff of creation.
And also,
we're very dualistic ourselves, really.
Just going back a bit to that thing we were talking about, Francis building the church, and there's you know, the pictures of Francis and the church. You see Francis down in one corner holding up a massive building, sort of being crushed underneath all this weight of the stones and everything, as if he's rebuilding the entire universal church throughout the world, throughout the ages, all of it hanging on one person. But when he had that thing to repair the church, what he did was go to one particular church and put one stone on top of another, and then one on top of that, and just get a bit of mortar and stick it in. So Francis wasn't trying to create a great new thing. He was just taking the immediacy, the physical task of construction.
And it's interesting that people joined him in doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an evangelistic pattern as well. It was
Messy Church. He was the founder of Messy Church.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Francis had a very low view of the human body for someone who so loves the rest of the created order. I mean, that's a really interesting observation, and thank you for that, Andy. Again, I think that this is something that, and I don't know what the others think, but my reading would be that Francis's low view of the human body was what started off with him himself as a young man, learning learning to be a religious. And of course, in at that time, it was standard practice to be very ascetic, to fast, to take it, to disabuse your body in order to to abuse your body in order to try and free yourself from all your many sins, so that low view of the human body was very much around for Francis as a younger person. And then I think what we see happening is that he probably stays with that for most of his life, but the change that happens is that he doesn't impose that on other people nearly as much. So the early brothers, I think, probably had quite a hard time with Francis. If you read the stories, they really, they didn't eat an awful lot, and he was pretty harsh with them. But then you get these lovely stories, and I think it mentioned, I think there's one mention in the book, about, so a brother wakes up groaning in pain because he's hungry in the middle of the night. And there's two versions of that story. One is that Francis gets up and eats with the brother to stop him feeling embarrassed. The other is that Francis doesn't just get up, he wakes the whole household and says, it's time for a meal, team, everybody up, because he doesn't want to make this brother feel ashamed. And then right at the end of his life, in his testament, he does actually say words about, and I can't remember them exactly, words about, actually, you know what, when I look back, I've probably been a bit tough on brother body, and I probably should have been a bit more gentle. So maybe we can see his harshness on his body, both in the context of the lifetime, the world that he lived in, and also in the context of someone who matures through. I don't know whether there's other comment from Nick and Sam.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, I do think the stories of him sort of rolling in the thorns or the snow to overcome his feelings, his lusts, does sound a bit extreme today, but and so I mean, he was just an extraordinary person. I mean, just bizarre in some situations, and I think we have to make room for his extraordinariness. He's not. I mean, what a sort of a psychotherapist would make of him today? I don't know.
Indeed. And if you look back through past copies of the Franciscan, I did once write an article about what it'd be like to be Francis's GP. For those of you who don't know, I used to be a GP, and I have to say, I think I'd have found it tough. So what would Francis, in his pre-scientific way, have thought of scientific or technical solutions to climate change? This is from John Wiltshire. What would Francis, in his pre-scientific way, have thought of scientific or technical solutions to climate change? I'm not sure I'm going to be very good at answering this. Maybe that's one for us all to mull over. But he was a man of his time, and he lived with the sort of things that were around. So I suspect he would be, if they were, if solutions were creation enhancing, I see no reason why he wouldn't want to enhance creation, the care of creation through scientific things. I don't think that there's an anti-science in the Franciscan story, though my colleagues might want to correct me on that at all. But I think what Francis would very definitely challenge us to do is to look into our hearts and to look into each of into the human responsibility, because what I see happening to do with some of climate change is of people saying we can sort this out technologically, so we don't have to worry, which to my view is absolutely bonkers, that we can sort some things out technologically. But actually, if there isn't a changing of hearts, which then results in a changing of behaviors, which then leads into the sort of radical dispossession in which we all see ourselves. Some of the next question down is, we should see ourselves equal with the rest of creation. Well, that means, of course, that we see ourselves equal with each other. So we see ourselves equal with the poorest of the poor people, as well as of equal value with all God's wonderful creation. So for me, I think Francis will be very firmly holding the mirror up to you and me and saying, right, guys, I mean, great, all the scientific stuff. What about changes in here where it really matters? Somebody else want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, perhaps if I just throw in something, but I think for people in that age, like the University of Paris in the 13th century, they wouldn't have seen a difference between science and theology. It'd be all part of the same overlapping system. So to say you'd not choose one or choose the other wouldn't quite make sense. So for Francis, it was really, is study at all a useful thing? And he wasn't quite sure about that. He thought that people shouldn't have books because they're too expensive, and people might get heirs and sit in their chair and ask for their book to be passed to them so they could read to everyone in the room. But when Anthony Padua came along and delighted people with his sermons, all extemporary, but all grounded in theology, Francis thought, well, actually, maybe that's not such a bad idea after all. So study was something that he took on in the end, and said, as long as you don't extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion, then it's fine. So do your clients kind of climate fixes, but don't lose the sense of piety, of devotion, of worship of God, and of realization of the preciousness of each other.
Thank you. What can we learn from Francis' continual thankfulness? For me, I'm just speaking for me here, separately, I guess, from the book. But I think as I've gone on in my spiritual journey, I've gradually learned to be thankful. I'll tell you one thing I was going to mention, and that was, do you know that bit from Seven Storey Mountain and Thomas Merton, where Merton's on the street corner and he tells you exactly what date it is and exactly what time it was, and when he suddenly realizes that he in the love of God, he loves all humanity. That he loves these people around him, the people in his community, and I sense a change in him from then, and about sort of actually appreciating others in a different way. And I wonder whether that's to do with thankfulness, because I've had an experience like that in my practice. I was just out doing my visits, and I suddenly had this overwhelming whoosh, and it was maybe you've had one too. Maybe everybody. I don't know. I'm not something I talk about very much, but there is something about actually learning this gratitude, this deep thankfulness, because I think it alters how what I said in my earlier presentation about relationship. It alters how we relate. It alters how we relate. If we can live in thankfulness for our brothers and sisters, human brothers and sisters, for our animal and our inanimate brothers and sisters, then it has to change us, and it has to change how we relate. And so actually, I think if we can think about this thankfulness, really, and I think it grows. It's grown in me. Maybe it's grown in you. I don't know. But it is an important thing, I think. And the more I go on, the more I think it's more important. I'll stop whiffling. Somebody else.
Can I just break in for a minute? Thankfulness is so important that we should adapt to the philosopher Descartes and say, I thank, therefore I am.
Yes. Yes. That's nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I remember John B. Taylor speaking to us at Hillfield back in 1976 or 81. He talked about Francis drawing from a fathomless well of gratitude. A fathomless well of gratitude. The more the more he drew out, the deeper the well became. And I'm reminded of that George Herbert poem called Gratefulness. Lord, give me a grateful heart, not thankful when it pleaseth me, as if thy blessing had spare days, but such a heart whose pulse might be thy praise. Just a wonderful thing of sort of a life shaped by thankfulness, and I think that was Francis, yes, and it changed his relationship with everyone and everything.
You could say that the grateful heart is the great heart, the great spelled Great. It's the big heart, the large heart.
Yes.
Heart.
Yeah.
It's the heart we need.
Thank you. There are quite a lot of comments about how do we listen to creation? How do we listen to creation? I'm not sure I've got an answer for that, apart from I think it's a terribly important question, and maybe it's one we should carry with us over the next weeks, and maybe we should all mull it over and pray about it and bring it back to the panel conversation in the final week, because would be one response. So in terms of how do we listen to creation, if you wanted to take that back down to the section that we're considering today, how did Francis listen to creation? Well, that's when you get into the stories, isn't it? So Francis listened by hearing this grasshopper and sort of letting the grasshopper help him with his prayers. That's a way of listening to creation, isn't it? Francis was, I guess, listening, you could argue, to the lamb that was being taken to market, that he then freed, and there's a whole story around that, as you know. So that's a way of listening to creation, isn't it? We can listen to creation, I think, in our. I mean, it was talking about the Eucharist, and how we hear the sacraments and how we listen to God, I guess, in creation, perhaps through the sacraments. One could argue. And I guess there's lots of other ways we listen to creation, like looking at a sunset, those sort of moments, a beautiful sunrise, a beautiful rainbow is listening to creation, isn't it? And then I guess part of that question is something to do with listening to creation in pain. And so when we see those pictures of forests being felled and all that sort of thing, one of the books, I don't know if Sam wants to say anything about it, but there's a lovely book. It's incredibly expensive, but if you can borrow one from the library, called Blue Sapphire of the Mind, and that's all about. Do you want to talk about that, Sam? Just to sort of say something about it, because I think that's about listening to creation.
Shani, he's got a whole lot of. There's a chapter on tears, on lament, on actually just on the business of allowing ourselves to lament over the loss which we see around us, not in a sense of sort of pointing a finger, but actually just taking in the loss which is happening around us, and of course we find that incredibly difficult because it is incredibly painful, and it's such a big loss that actually we want to avoid it if we can. We shut our eyes to it and shut our hearts to it.
Is the name of that book is mentioned in Seeing Differently, isn't it?
Yes, it's
Blue Sapphire of the Mind.
Blue Sapphire of the Mind. It's one of the. It's in the bibliography.
One of the things I would just say to add, Simon, is that of course Francis spent a lot of his time outdoors, and it wasn't just because Italy is a nice warm place. Assisi can be bitterly cold from November through until March. I mean, very, very cold.
And very foggy.
And yes, that's right, and wet and everything. So, but I mean, he did. I mean, people lived much more outdoors. So, that was as it. We are well defended against creation. We shut our doors and we live inside, and we live through screens.
To go back a step, I believe the Queen said in the last 2 or 3 days, the price of love is grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She did say that, yeah.
Mm. Thank you.
I think you touched on it, Simon, about creation being a sacrament. Did you mention that, or did I hear about? You were talking about the sacraments, but actually, some would say that creation itself is a sacrament.
Indeed, a gift by which,
yeah,
as a gift of God through which we see something of spiritual things. Indeed, and
perhaps another way of listening to God is seeing God as an icon or a sacrament, and quite from Bonaventure, I think. This footprints of God is very much
the vestiges
about that. Yeah,
I love that idea of the footprint, as it was that in every creature he sees the mark, the footprint imprinted on that creature. So the smallest atom bears as it were, the maker's mark of the creator.
Yeah, it's lovely that, isn't it? Really, really lovely. And I thank you. Someone has highlighted a quote. This is Emily Miller's group discussed the quote: "Humanity is creation become conscious of itself. The human voice therefore speaks on behalf of all that is created." And the group says, that's the quote. The group says we need to be silent to listen to nature before we can advocate for creation. And so I think that's a lovely point to highlight our responsibility to creation. Becomes more and more profound the more we damage creation, I guess. Thank you. James Fox Robinson has sent us a long thing. I don't know whether you want to read it. It's at 8:28 in the chat box. I'm interested to explore whether we're moving towards a post-secular culture. Gosh, this is heavy stuff, isn't it? Well done, James's group. You're really on it. Franciscan spirituality as countercultural. I believe there's an increasing understanding of moving away from consumerism. If you look at, he says, he writes, membership of the Green Party, expressions of church based in nature, eco-theology, the number of events like this. And I guess the challenge for us, the group says perhaps this is just a growing gap between consumers and ecologists. But I guess the challenge for you and me as people who are trying to follow in the way of Francis is that we're called to pray, but we're also called to act, to have dirty feet, to get our hands dirty and involved. And so the challenge really is, well, how do we link this up? How do we help people to see what we see in Francis, that they see we see this as a whole picture, that actually to join the Green Party is inherently, it seems to me, a Franciscan things to do, and to be involved in eco-theology in some way is inherently Franciscan. And maybe the First Order guys who are here would like to comment on how that relates to them. But I think for me in the Third Order, and I hear from other people, actually this is really, really, really important. And how do we live that? And how do we take our culture beyond secular, because undoubtedly, although we in theory live in a Western secular culture, there's a lot of movement away from that as well. So somebody else want to pick that up?
Nick, do you want to?
Yes, I mean, it's true. It is important to move away from consumerism. But I don't think the First Order have the answer, really, in some ways. I mean, I had more spending power as a friar than I ever had before I joined. I was living as a kind of student, and I joined the order with £200 to my name, and that was it. nothing beyond that. So we all of us have to struggle with that, and keeping buildings in good shape so that the rain's not going to come through the roof and the walls not going to fall down. Of responsibilities to live like that, and to buy books on theology, or buy books on eco-awareness made out of trees. So it's never an easy choice between being for ecology or against support of the natural world. So it's complicated, but it's by little actions that big things happen. It's like one person, like what's her name, Greta, who sat on her own outside that the Parliament building in Sweden, just with a little placard, and every half an hour somebody walked past and said, "Why aren't you in school?" And from that, a great movement has come along. So we just need to find a wall to sit next to, and a placard to put beside us, whatever that may be. And it's maybe not noticed by others, but something that makes a difference.
There are new ways of being church, such as Forest Church, and some of the messy church is out there and sort of contacting more with nature and the spirituality of creation. I think someone mentioned wilding, and I know that is a theme. Is it Rachel Summers? But I don't know much about that. Do you know anything, Simon, about wilding?
I know. No. We've got a group in the parish looking at rewilding our churchyard. That's as far as we've got.
There is a book coming out called Rewilding the Church, being reviewed in the Franciscan, which is due to fall on your doorstep within the next 2 weeks.
Do you know anything more about that, Nicholas?
I haven't read it, no. It's Clark Berge in Hillfield who did the review for us. But it's taking the issue of rewilding in general and applying those principles to the church. Things go a bit chaotic. Room for the
Can I just ask one question on the back of that?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Well, as I read the book and as I've listened to, we're not talking about this evening, but other conversations between Christians on ecology, I wonder whether I'm left with the feeling, are we going down a road of ecology, seeing Francis as the great ecologist, and missing actually what Francis was actually seeing? It wasn't so much, I have to be careful here, was it actually his great love of nature, or was it something different from that, that we as Franciscans need to remember? Otherwise, we simply go down a very important route of valuing ecology. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I just wonder whether Francis had something slightly different that we need to hold to. Does that make sense?
Well, do you have a thought about what that different thing is?
Well, I think yes. So, I mean, in reading your book, one of the things that came up really strongly for me was this matter of seeing God in all things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's that aspect. And I've got nothing against ecology. I think it's really important that we support that. And Francis is the patron. But I wouldn't want that to be at the cost of not recognizing the most important thing, which was Francis saw God in all things.
And so, I mean, putting it bluntly, John, is that Francis didn't worship nature.
Yeah.
I mean, he saw all things pointing towards and giving praise to God.
And that was what came through really strongly in the book, actually.
And that's what I think comes through in your chapter on the Canticle, Simon. It's a great hymn in which all things, all creatures, everything is finding its true end in God. You know, because I actually, to worship nature is as idolatrous as worshipping your washing machine or your new car. You know, it's just as much a sort of a dead end. And that's why I think it's important to move away from the sort of the purely sentimental pictures of Francis, of being sort of enjoying the fluffy animals and you know, sort of doting on animals as sort of as ends in themselves, really. That he actually saw that they led him deeper into God, and with a deep love for them, was his part of his love for God.
It's quite interesting in Francis' writings, and this is the Franciscan nerd in me, but he only actually writes about animals 5 times himself. All the rest is the stories, and so, you know, that sort of, whereas think of all the prayers that he wrote, and think of the instructions for his brothers in how to live and telling us how to, you know, so that really puts in context, it feels to me, where Francis was personally in terms of a relationship with the animal kingdom. And I also think, just to sort of, I don't know, yeah, to add to that a little bit, the one or two people have commented about Francis and that when the relationship gets pragmatic, shall we say? And you know, here's Francis who eats meat, which most religious don't at the time, who curses a sow that killed a lamb, there's a robin that falls in the water, and Francis said words to the effect of good, because it had been eating too much and had been bullying all its partners. So he's got a very, none of those would be particularly necessarily ecological, you know, sit well with a purely ecological approach to a relationship with creation. We've got 5 minutes left, and I just had a couple of other things I wanted to just pick up, if that's all. Is that all right if we leave that with there, John? Is that okay? Somebody's written, can we hear more about the canticles and interior journey? Thank you for that. When I reread the book the other day, I thought, oh, I don't know about that section. And I was really beating myself up for it, if it's any, and I think it was because there's a lot more that one could say about the canticle as interior journey, that perhaps isn't said in that chapter, in that section of chapter 3. It's the last bit of chapter 3. And I guess maybe that's the challenge to you, the reader, because Francis has given us this great gift of the canticle. It's a prayer, it's a poem, it's the first great poem in the Italian vernacular. It's a great piece of writing, and I've unpacked that, I think, in that chapter a bit. But I wonder whether actually each of us needs to go through each verse of the canticle. You know, and I've written, the sun has carried symbolic meaning for millennia. Well, what symbolic meaning does the sun carry for you? What symbolic meaning does night carry for you? How does that relate to where you are in your spiritual journey? Fire is one of the great symbols of humanity's life and energy, both life-giving and destroying. So Francis loved fire so much, he was prepared to let his burn down at La Verna, rather than put the fire out. What is that? You know, how is that in terms of you, and what ignites you, what excites you in your spiritual journey, what draws you closer to God? Because it feels to me like ultimately, if we're not drawing closer to God in some way, each of us every day, and as we say our prayers, as we read the scriptures, as we think about how we are in living our lives, then we're perhaps losing something of what our Franciscan charisma is about. So I wonder, I guess I'd want to just sort of gently ask you guys to reflect on, well, okay, if this section, Simon thinks he could have written a whole load more about interior journey there, maybe you could write that for yourself, you know, and really think it through and pray it through. And so it's quite a good, this is the teacher in me coming out. I'm really sorry. I used to teach students, and so here we are getting towards the end of the session, and I'm giving you some homework and something to go away and read about and think about and pray about. There you go. You can take the teacher out of the institution. You can't take, I don't know, there's some phrase around that.
Thank you.
Could I just say that, Simon, I really welcomed that section of your book. I thought that it was tremendously helpful, because as much as we say to ourselves and others that the stories are powerful and suggestive, we also need to talk about the way in which legendary stories work for us in a powerful way. And I thought you were doing that, and I was very, very pleased to read it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's helpful.
Simon, you're muted.
So I've just been muted. Helen's now talking away, but she's on mute, so we can't.
And I've just been talking and I'm on mute. And I was going to say thank you very much, Simon. Okay, plenty to think and to pray about, I think, from what you've said, and things to bring into the plenary at the end of our sessions for the panel. There's things about science and theology which are picked up. I love the idea of the fathomless well of gratitude, which was we were reminded about by Sam, and also about that listening and listening to creation and even to the pain in creation. And then you've just given us a meditation really on the canticles as our homework. So what a feast and plenty to ponder. And I wondered if we just have a few minutes, but if you would allow me just to read through the canticles of the creatures as our final sort of act of worship before God tonight.
Before we do that, can I just say thank you, everybody, and we will look at everything that's in the chat. We obviously haven't covered everything, and we will feed it back, particularly into session 4, and try and synthesize that. So thank you, and thank you, Susan, for chairing us, and thank you for leading us in prayer as we finish.
Fine. Yeah, I see there's 53 messages, so there's lots there, Simon. So let us be quiet as we listen to the canticle. Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, to you be praise, glory, honor, and all blessing. Only to you, Most High, do they belong, and no one is worthy to call upon your name. May you be praised, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, through whom you lighten the day for us. He is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. He signifies you, O Most High. Be praised, my Lord, for Sister Moon and the stars. Clear and precious and lovely, they are formed in heaven. Be praised, my Lord, for Brother Wind, and by air and clouds, clear sky and all weathers, by which you give sustenance to your creatures. Be praised, my Lord, for Sister Water, who is very useful and humble and precious and pure. Be praised, my Lord, for Brother Fire, by whom the night is illumined for us. He is beautiful and cheerful, full of power and strength. Be praised, my Lord, for Sister, our Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us and produces diverse fruits and coloured flowers and grass. Be praised, my Lord, by all who forgive for love of you, and who bear weakness and tribulation. Blessed are those who bear them in peace, for by you, Most High, they will be crowned. Be praised, my Lord, for our sister, the death of the body, from which no one living is able to flee. Woe to those who are dying in mortal sin. Blessed are those who are found doing your most holy will, for the second death will do them no harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. So may the risen Lord Jesus bless us. May he watch over us and renew us as he renews the whole of creation. May our hearts and lives echo his love. Amen.
Amen.
Well, we will depart in peace, and the next session is on Thursday week. Just looking for the date. It's on the 22nd of April. Thank you all for participating and for your contributions, and thank you again to the authors and to Helen and John.
Yes.
So
thank you too.
I will email you all during the week. Hopefully you'll get a record from the chat. I'll send the link again, and we'll make a slightly different suggestion for logging in next week so that not too many people have to sit for half an hour, but likewise, everybody's not trying to get in at the last minute. Thank you very much, everyone.
I leave now.
Thank you.
good night.
Night.
Night. Leave.
Good night, everybody.